going to get started. So my name is Marian Bidler, and I'm a professor of economics and the interim director of the Institute for Social Sciences here at UC Davis. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our final and fourth ISS Noon Lecture of the quarter. These lectures illuminate topical cutting-edge social sciences research taking place on our campus and offer the faculty an opportunity to present their work to an interdisciplinary audience, although I don't know how interdisciplinary we are today. And we've been also focusing on faculty who are new to UC Davis this fall. These are just one of many events that are hosted or supported by ISS, and if you want to stay up to date on them, you can check out our website, subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and YouTube. So before I introduce our speaker today, I also wanted to mention the 2017 ISS Distinguished Lecture, which will take place this evening at the Buehler Alumni Center. Asaf Razin, a visiting professor in the Department of Economics, will be giving a talk entitled Israel and the World Economy. And there will be a reception at 5, and the lecture starts at 5:30, and you're all invited to come to that as well if you like. And presenting for us today is Associate Professor of Communications, Magdalena Wojcieszak. I appreciate that very much, although Ben had attempted to find for us the pronunciation as well. Dr. Wojcieszak, who earned her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, joined UC Davis from the University of Amsterdam this fall, and she's actually on leave, so we're thrilled she came in today to talk to us. She's interested in political communication, public opinion, and how the changing media environment creates both opportunities and challenges for informed publics, tolerant citizenry, and responsive governance. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Communication, Public Opinion Quarterly, and Political Communication, amongst other journals, and she's an editor of the International Journal of Public Opinion Research. As she presents a lecture entitled Fragmented Media and Social Divides, please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you all for coming. And I also especially would like to thank the organizers for inviting me for this talk. So today I will give you an overview of my very, very, very current and fresh research. A couple of studies that I will present do not have data yet, so it's that fresh. And all of those studies relate to how the fragmented media environment foments social divides and how we can use this very same media environment to ameliorate those divides. But first, a few things about myself. Prior to joining UC Davis just this summer, I was an associate professor at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam, so a lot of rain. Prior to that, I was an assistant professor at IE University in Spain, so a lot of sunshine and a lot of the wine. And prior to that, I got my PhD in communication from the Annenberg School of Communication Research at the University of Pennsylvania. And having grown up in communist Poland, in a family of journalists, I have long been aware of the importance of the media and public opinion in the processes of democracy, mobilizing citizens, and so forth. And in general, I've been interested in how new and old media influence individual opinions, attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors in the context of tolerance, extremism, polarization, and intergroup relations. And I've applied that expertise to various sociopolitical contexts as well, studying these processes in countries such as the US or Spain, but also Sudan and Iran. And underlying all these interests is an overarching question as to what are the implications of the rapidly changing media environment for citizens, public opinion, and responsive governance. And so this is a depiction of this rapidly changing media environment. So we see abundance of sources and nearly unlimited media options online and offline. And although this abundance was hoped to increase knowledge, increase civic engagement, increase intergroup communication, this is not really the case. And why is that? So the first problem we see is the problem of selective exposure. So given this abundance, people have to actively choose. And at the first stage, they have to choose whether to read an article about current affairs or about sports and celebrities, for instance. And although it's maybe difficult for some of us to imagine, many people find politics very boring. So at this first selection stage, many people actually read entertainment or non-political content. And that, of course, has implications for their knowledge, political efficacy, and so forth. And at the second stage, when people do select news and current affairs, they engage in what's called partisan selectivity, which means that they select information that confirms their prior biases. So for instance, Republicans in the US turn to Fox News at greater rate than the Democrats, for example. But also, say, immigration opponent is more likely to read an article that also is oppositional toward immigration. And here you see some depictions of this phenomenon. So you see a network of the American blogosphere, where the Republican and Democratic blogs are further away and separated from each other. And you see some data from Pew Research Center that shows that conservatives are more likely to see like-minded information on social media, but it's actually the liberals who are more likely to unfriend or block others because of their political views. So again, this insulated cocoon. And this naturally has numerous consequences that may be detrimental to democracy. So when people are in those informational cocoons, hearing like-minded voices and secluded from different perspectives, they become more extreme, more hostile toward the other side, and different social groups drift further away from each other. And we see various examples of this growing polarization in the US as related to the Trump presidency, but not only. Prior to that, there's also evidence of polarization. And in Europe, as related to the influx of refugees. And those are only two among many divisive issues in the US and internationally. So given these growing tensions, the key question is how to enhance understanding between conflicted citizens and conflicted social factions. And many scholars and practitioners focus on promoting exposure to dissimilar perspectives in the media. And actually there is research in the US happening right now as to how we can nudge individuals to see different views on the internet. Also, Facebook right now is actively working on how to diversify a newsfeed, political newsfeed of individuals. And in fact, theories have long claimed that exposure to different perspectives is democratically beneficial. So it is said to promote representative thinking and sound political judgment and transform different and conflicted people into a cohesive collective. And so, for instance, if an immigration opponent reads an article that's positive toward immigration, he will become more understanding of the other side. So that's the hope. But some empirical work points to dangers of this similar exposure and suggests that it may actually backfire. So research in psychology shows that people do not process different views even-handedly. So we people tend to counter-argue and dismiss dissimilar arguments, and we readily accept information and arguments that confirm what we already believe. And needless to say, that also can polarize attitudes and make them more extreme. So that immigration opponent, when reading this article supportive of immigration, could become more prejudiced and yet more hostile. So the fundamental question is how to not only encourage exposure to diverse and dissimilar views, but also how to encourage people to process it even-handedly toward minimizing polarization and intergroup hostility. So in my carrot and plant research, I focus precisely on those two questions. How can we overcome selectivity in the current media environment? And how to attenuate biased information processing of diverse and dissimilar political content. And the idea that I am exploring right now, some of the studies as we speak, is incorporating certain cues or prompts in the media exposure context. And I argue that some carefully chosen and theoretically grounded cues or prompts, and I will tell you more in a second, have the promise to minimize selectivity and biased information processing. So the first idea is to prime social norms. So as you all know, social norms are very powerful predictors of our behaviors. So perhaps they can also influence our information selection and processing. So in a recent experiment, I focused on a general normative assumption about how citizens in a democratic society should or ought to approach political information. So we focused on social norms promoting open-mindedness, which is a factor that's not also important to democratic theory, but also important or relevant to the current polarized climate. So our key contention is that promoting social norms of open-mindedness can encourage people to select diverse and dissimilar content, and thereby, through that selection, minimize polarization. And I will talk about what I mean by that. So we relied on a systematic sample recruited by Survey Sampling International with quotas set so that that sample approximates the general American population. And what's important here, we excluded people who were neutral toward President Trump. So we only included Trump supporters and opponents in the final sample. So we had roughly 400 people who were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. A norm of open-mindedness, norm of close-mindedness, and a control. And this condition here was included because the current media reporting may suggest that it's actually close-mindedness that's the current new norm, or current new normal. So we actually looked at what happens when people are led to believe that seeking like-minded information is beneficial and popular. And after these prompts, people could select content, and then the post-test was administered. So here I have a description of short texts that we used after piloting them to prime social norms. So here, first, the open-mindedness social norm text presented a study that majority of Americans is willing to hear new ideas, and also had an additional paragraph that listening to these similar views is democratically beneficial. And the close-minded social norm had equal length, and also first presented a study showing that majority of the population prefers content that agrees with their priors, and also another paragraph that this behavior is beneficial for democracy because it fosters political participation. And after that, people could select information from this professionally designed mock news site. This is a screenshot. The website contained 12 articles on 4 different issues: on healthcare, refugees, immigration, and climate change. And on each issue, there were 3 articles. One that was pro-Trump policies on those issues. So for instance, President Trump's effort to restrict immigration will protect our country. One article that was anti-Trump policies. So, for example, his restrictive immigration policies are a huge mistake, and one that was balanced. And here, there were 12 articles presented in random order. And while people were selecting information, the software running unobtrusively recorded which articles they clicked on and how much time they spent reading those articles. So again, the hope was that those partisans in the open-minded norm prompt will select more counter-attitudinal and balanced articles than pro-attitudinal. And that this will decrease their affective polarization toward political opponents. So here are some indicators of affective polarization as is measured in political science currently. So we looked at common intergroup identity. So asking partisans, do you think that Trump supporters and Trump opponents represent one and the same group, Americans? Or do they have nothing in common with each other? So there were 4 statements getting at that idea. Social distance as well. So the reported comfort or discomfort having a Trump supporter and opponent as a neighbor on the same street or as a physician or family member by marriage. Outgroup hostility, which is feeling thermometers, how people feel toward Trump supporters and opponents, from 0 very cold to 100 very warm. And negative trait evaluation. So are those opponents open-minded or hypocritical or American? So the results. So in general, we did find that people selected more information that confirmed their prior beliefs. So yes, they engaged in selective exposure. They selected more articles and spent more time reading like-minded than balanced or counter-attitudinal content. And were there any effects of the prime of open-mindedness? So here is a model that presents both direct and indirect effects, and here's our open-minded condition. And as you can see, as expected, partisans who were told that being open-minded is not only popular but also beneficial, did select more balanced articles. And they also spent more time reading that balanced content. Here it's only for the number of selection. However, unlike we predicted, the norm of open-mindedness didn't influence their selection of counter-attitudinal articles. And also, exposure to balanced, two-sided political arguments didn't have any significant effects on our outcome variables. So here I'm presenting only one, but that was the case for others. And as you can see here, as literature suggests, pro-attitudinal exposure did make people more polarized, but that the hypothesized path through balanced exposure was not significant. And we also checked whether that pattern of effects held separately for Trump supporters and opponents, and we didn't find many differences between those two groups, but I'm happy to talk about that later. So this study found that social norms of open-mindedness do encourage people to look at balanced content, but not a dissimilar one. And this attention, however, does not translate into decreased polarization. And it needs to be noted that we had a very, very challenging context in which to influence individual selection of information and attitudes, because we only looked at partisans, so those who favor or oppose Trump. We looked at information about very salient and divisive political issues. So not something that's not as important to individuals, but rather refugees and immigration and climate change, so very divisive topics. And we also asked people about their attitudes toward explicit political opponents. So again, even though those findings are not very strong, they're still noteworthy in the context of the largest conflict in contemporary history of the US. So, now off to a second theoretical cue. So I propose to apply common intergroup identity model to the same problems of selective exposure and polarization. So very briefly, the common intergroup identity model suggests that if we invite people from different and conflicted groups to recategorize themselves as part of one overarching group, intergroup bias will diminish. Okay? And I argue that cues that can prime that common intergroup identity also have the potential to reduce selective exposure, biased information processing, and polarization. So I am now fielding a study on a sample of participants in which people are randomly assigned to one of three conditions, either common intergroup identity, partisan identity, or control. Then again, their new selection is unobtrusively tracked, and then there is a post list. So what's the common identity for partisans in the US? Well, that's the American identity. And some past research shows that, in fact, when partisans are invited to think of themselves as Americans, they become less negative toward one another. So in the piloted cues, we asked people to think of what it means to you to be American. What do you have in common with other American people? And they had to write that, or they yes. In the partisan identity prime, depending on their prior partisanship, people were asked to think about those common shared values with other partisans, Republicans or Democrats. And the control just told us what they see in their surroundings. And again, that's the same website from which people could select information following the prime. And at the posters, we again measured affective polarization and also perceived outgroup homogeneity and behavioral intentions toward partisans from the other party. And here's the general model, still without the results. As I mentioned, this is being fielded right now. So we predicted that in the national identity prime, the common intergroup identity prime, people will select more balanced and more counter-attitudinal stories, which again will translate to decreased polarization. And it can be expected, and I will tell you once I analyze the data, that the partisan primes will increase the number, there are no arrows here, of pro-attitudinal stories read, which will increase polarization. So again, the results are coming soon, so stay tuned for that. And in a study too, to that particular study, I also will test biased information processing. So after being assigned to the cues, people will see a series of arguments, pro-attitudinal, balanced, or counter-attitudinal. And after each argument, they will list their thoughts and rate the argument. So again, the hope is that those who are primed with common intergroup identity will have lower levels of biased information processing. So they will rate the arguments as stronger and counter-argue them less. And also here I included, because I'm in the process with a colleague from the department, to probably testing that also using physiological measures. So how people's heart rate or skin conductance changes when they see pro or counter-attitudinal content, and whether that depends on the primes that they see first. And then also some other ideas that I hope to study soon is to, for instance, show people counter-attitudinal content, but recommended by an in-group member. That's likely to increase people's openness to that kind of content. And also make people feel positive or happy or good about themselves. And that's likely to minimize their defensive reactions and encourage more balanced content selection and information processing. And another theoretical idea as to how to minimize polarization is to promote online intergroup contact. So in general, as many of you know, intergroup contact theory suggests that encounters across group divides reduce prejudice. But we also know that many racial, educational, and other groups are separated, so do not come into frequent direct contact with each other. And also many people who are prejudiced actively avoid contact with different people. So scholars promote various forms of indirect contact. And one of those that I studied was online contact through new communication technologies. And here I conceptualized it in a very minimal way. So reading comments written by an outgroup member and posted online under news articles. And those kind of online comments in news sections are not only very popular and prevalent, but also very often, as some research shows, they entail users sharing their personal stories and private experiences. So I propose that such online intergroup contact can minimize polarization and improve attitudes toward outgroups. So in a recent experiment, we tested actually two types of online contact. One was a direct online contact, so people reading a post written by an outgroup member directly, or extended online contact. So learning about an outgroup member through a perspective or reading a post written by an in-group member or a control. And we tested this on two issues, gays and lesbians and undocumented immigrants. I will only focus on the gays and lesbians condition here for time's sake. So here you see that there is a very short brief about legalization of gay marriage, and here there is a post by a person who identifies as gay with gender-neutral name, talking about their private personal experiences. And ending, my personal story clearly shows that legalizing gay marriage was a good and beneficial decision. In the extended contact condition, this brief is exactly the same. However, here it's a straight person who has a good friend who is gay. And it's the same story, but about the friend of the person who is posting. And in the control condition, it's again exactly the same lead, but a general, impersonal story about many gay Americans are able to, and so forth. So we hypothesized that this direct intergroup contact will have the strongest effect on outgroup attitudes, and we also tested the emotional mechanisms through which that contact can work. So after exposure, we measured different forms of threat towards the two outgroups tested, also social distance, and also positive and negative emotions experienced while reading the comment. And here we indeed find that the direct contact effect reduced all forms of threat and also social distance relative to the control and extended contact condition. And the extended contact condition didn't have any significant effects. And also, direct contact made people feel more positive, more happy, more enthusiastic during exposure, which significantly reduced all threat and social distance perceptions. And also, direct contact reduced negative emotions, which were anger and anxiety. So people reading that story of a gay person felt less anxious, less negative, less angry. And again, that translated into improved outgroup attitudes. And we also see here that extended contact with gays and lesbians had no effect. So the indirect effects were also insignificant. And I'm happy to talk about the immigrant condition because the results were slightly different. So here we actually found stronger effects from extended contact with immigrants than from direct contact. So in general, this last study suggests that online contact can be fruitfully conceptualized in this simple minimalistic way as encountering an outgroup in online comments. And such direct contact can improve outgroup attitudes. And in this study, it also did so through eliciting positive and minimizing negative emotions. And extended contact didn't quite make any difference here. So in sum, yes, the current media environment may be to blame for the extraordinary levels of polarization that we observe in the US and internationally. But in my view, it's very important to focus not only on diagnosing these problems and showing how the media environment makes people more extreme or hostile, but actually to start identifying solutions. And here I show that some cues in the media exposure context are also online, encountering outgroup members online can make a difference. So the next steps are to see whether those cues or prompts work in naturalistic context, so outside of experimental setting, and also to start thinking about how they can actually be implemented on online news websites of actual media organizations, to see whether that, when applied on broader aggregate scale, they can actually make some difference, even if minimal, hopefully cumulative. So in my perspective, this research is not only theoretically and methodologically fruitful, but it's also very needed and important precisely because it can be applied. So we as social scientists, I believe, need to use our time and brain and resources to aim to find ways in which the current media environment or communication in general or other things that you study can be used to increase understanding between conflicted citizens. And this end goal is crucial and very pressing in the highly polarized climate. So I can end here. I also have some other slides, but I think that if I end here, it will give us more time for for discussion.
Go a couple more minutes, or we could do Q&A now.
I think let's do, because that will there will be about another project that's a little bit longer.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll finish here. Thank you.
So what kind of naturalistic settings, like what kind of partners would you work with to try to make this happen in the wild, so to speak?
So hopefully media organizations, so probably first it would be some local media organizations that would be willing to have a banner on the website. And then of course they all track the exposure of users, so to see whether, for instance, having that banner versus having a different banner. So that would be a little bit more complicated, but hopefully randomized exposure to versus having no banner encourages different selection patterns on part of the users. Also, it will be amazing to have partnership with Facebook, for instance, but that's classified and they don't allow scholars to publish from their data. But that, I'm sure that they are already doing something like that on us here. Yeah.
Last few weeks, CNN's been running this Facts Matter campaign, showing basically an apple. So there's an apple, you can call it a banana, but it's still an apple.
Yeah.
That seems to fit in here somehow, in that, but in a different way. And that it's not telling people to not be partisan, but to focus on what's real. Have you looked at that campaign and thought about how that plugs in? Because that sort of connects with the, how do you do this in the real world?
Yeah. So there's fantastic research along those lines on misinformation and fake news. Yeah. So and it's very similar mechanisms because here in that kind of so in the research on minimizing exposure to misinformation or more accurate perceptions of facts, which is funny that we were talking about that even, that that facts need to be perceived accurately, but it is a problem. So in that work, people do find that even when people are told that this is a banana or this is an apple, they will still think it's a banana. So and there is a lot of fantastic research on that, and even when you correct people, even if you tell them what they are saying, they're still misperceiving. So so it's a line of research that's similar to this one, kind of runs in parallel, and it's drastically difficult to alter people's perceptions. So there was a research that showed people a line that unemployment decreased during the Obama administration, but looking at the line, Republicans, and especially strong Republicans, still said that unemployment increased. So they saw a decreasing declining line, but still reported increase. So I'm curious to see where the CNN campaign will go, because, yeah. And plus, CNN is not the most credible source for those who most need to believe in accuracy of facts. So So it could also be the case that it actually backfires among Republicans, because of course CNN has an agenda. So they say it's an apple, so of course it's a banana. That kind of defense. Yeah.
Just a comment on the same notion. There's another study looking at climate change data. So they showed people the figure of the trends of the global temperature. Actually, that figure with the trends actually correct people's perception of climate change. So that's another study showing in some topic it may be working, but maybe not in that job of employment case. Yeah.
So for sure, and that's something that's a testable proposition, the more divisive and the more polarized and the more value-laden a topic, the more people will be protecting the priors. So they will, so apple bananas, they will see it's an apple, but if it was something about abortion or maybe climate change or other more divisive issue, immigration, refugees, probably it wouldn't work as well. Yeah, so it's for sure topic dependent.
Yeah. I have another question. Going back to the study about the gay lesbian issue, so did you measure their previous attitudes toward that group?
Yes.
So my assumption is maybe that probably will somehow moderate the effect.
So actually I forgot to mention that, but yes, we measured their prior beliefs, and everybody in the sample on both issues was assigned to read a comment that was counteracted. So actually the entire, in this study that I presented, the entire sample was oppositional, so opposed either gay marriage or path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants in the U.S. So everybody was an opponent, and so a comment that was supportive of both policies. Yeah. And we looked at moderation. We looked at whether social dominance orientation or modern racism and right-wing authoritarianism moderate these effects, but they didn't. Yeah, so we looked at some other moderators, yeah.
But I think showing that effect with the direct contact is very amazing about it. Because like on the surface it seems to be very difficult to change, especially when I looked at the direct contact and indirect contact. So the intuition would be that indirect contact condition may have a bigger effect, but it became not significant.
Yeah, so see that's the thing where I mentioned that for undocumented immigrants, actually we saw indirect effects through extended contact. And I think that this difference is because more people in the US have direct contact with gays and lesbians than with undocumented immigrants. And also it's a less divisive issue. So people are much more positive toward, or much more supportive of gay marriage than they are of allowing more immigrants in or the path to citizenship. So, so direct contact with a gay person was less maybe threatening or less awkward than direct contact with undocumented immigrant. So here, that knowing that an American friend has an undocumented immigrant as a friend worked better. So I think also that here is group specific.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a way to look at when people think it's direct contact, but it's actually a bot. You know, if they become
Yeah.
a, sort of start to consider a robot account, a fake account, to be a friend in their network, and after a
Yeah.
while they consider it to be a real
Oh, wow.
person.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not a real human that's posting the things or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. It would be interesting to check. Whether after they already engage in some contact, they learn that it's a fake account. Yeah.
Right, because I think I read that Facebook is going to be alerting people to fake posts that they, or bot posts that they liked or shared during the election cycle.
Yeah.
Whether that will really change people's opinions of those posts or whatever.
So actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I was at UCSB at a small symposium on fake news and misinformation, and there was a representative from Facebook, and she was talking about that. And apparently, based on their initial tests, including kind of a triangle with a warning sign that this is fake information, doesn't make any difference. And, yeah. So let's see.
Does it make any difference immediately or in the long run?
I don't know.
Because there's research going way back that shows that eventually the source of
Sleeper.
information becomes disassociated with the information. So.
Yeah.
Well, I think it depends on what it matters for what. I mean, I think most people, even if you go over there and correct them and you tell them, actually, I go to my friends and tell them, actually that what you just shared is fake news. They just, all they reply is, ha ha ha. And I was thinking about why do they do that? And then I started to understand, because it's ha ha ha, because let's say the utility function of social media is not to talk about the truth. It's about to get more likes and more views and more. And so if you go from that as being your utility function, then it does not matter if it's fake news or not fake news, because it will still give you more like and more attention.
Yeah.
So in the attention economy, it is ha ha ha, what do I care if it's fake or
Yeah,
not?
yeah.
I still get more views and more likes, and that's all that matters in that game.
Yeah.
And that's the question, what is social media for, right?
Yeah.
I with social media, I think it's absolutely not about spreading the truth or discussing the truth. People are aware of that, and they know it's not for that.
So maybe Facebook, rather than including those triangles, they should be blocking, unobtrusively blocking the feature to like. And then kind of, after a while.
No, but then Zuckerberg he always argued they're not a news channel, right? Because if Zuckerberg would confess that yes, they're a news organization, they would fall under the libel laws, under the ownership laws, under the whatever, and that's what he's fighting against. So he, yeah.
But then also there's this growing body of data that Facebook is the major news source for a growing number of people.
Right, but then he could be sued personally for spreading lies.
Yeah.
That's why he doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
Your open-mindedness manipulation of a crime basically says other people you're ignoring might have something to say, so you should listen to them, right? Is that the idea behind there?
Not really. So basically, here I just. So it was. So of course this is just a description because it was 2 paragraphs, 2 short paragraphs. So in the first it was a study. So it was an injunctive a descriptive social norm, saying that majority of the population is willing to consider different ideas, even if they come from across the partisan aisle. And then there was another paragraph with a quote from the study author that said that this is democratically beneficial and that looking at giving full attention to different viewpoints is crucial to good citizenship. So it wasn't kind of directly like, oh, they maybe have something important. It was more.
But presumably that's the reason why.
Oh yeah.
Another way potential manipulation that might be stronger, going back to all that old research on counter-attitudinal advocacy, is to get people to kind of undermine their own position.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so ask a Clinton supporter, can you think of 5 things you wish Clinton would do differently, or think
Yeah.
ways she
Yeah.
might be
Yeah.
do differently? And the same for Trump supporters.
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
don't know if anyone's done that in your field.
I'm not aware of that, so thank you for the idea.
Something to
Yeah.
pursue.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of here it's what I mentioned at the end. Most of the prompts that I'm trying to test are those that I hope will be implemented in some way. So of course, nobody's going to read 2 paragraphs before selecting news or write about what they wish Clinton had done differently. But for sure, experimentally, that will be stronger, or likely it'll be a stronger prime. So yeah, I will try to test it. Yeah.
Is it possible that those participants, after reading those prompts, and they realized what they were expected to do? For example, those who read the open-minded social norm, and they were expected to choose those counter-attitudinal articles, so they did that. So it's not actually the effect of those paragraphs. It's actually they want to cooperate with the researcher.
So, in a sense, I see what you mean. At the end, we included an open-ended question asking whether kind of what they think the study was about, and nobody got at that. But in a sense, in this particular context, it's one and the same, in a sense, because yes, it is about this similar exposure and its benefits. So if they comply with the researchers, they also follow the norm. You know what I mean? So it's so in this case, I wouldn't see it as a direct problem. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.